Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to what is quickly spiraling into a bear attack area in need of intervention. Western Montana has been featured on this channel time and time again, so this time is no surprise. Near the town of Big Sky is a trail system known as the Yellow Mule Trails. The mountains around the town tower to over 10,000 feet, with Gallatin Peak being the tallest. The steep granite mountains are crowded with expansive stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, and contain pockets of aspen interspersed here and there. Along nearly every body of water, you may find bulrush and willow cushioned by lush grasses between. It is a sportsman's paradise here, but recently it became a sportsman's nightmare. At about 1:45 p.m. on September 8, 2023, 61-year-old Rudy Norlander was up doing what he loved, hunting and being in the outdoors. Rudy is the owner of Alpine Adventures, an ATV rental company in Big Sky. He is a U.S. Navy veteran. Anyone who knew Rudy understood he was always prepared. He was a fan of the hit TV show Survivor and even tried to audition. On this day, he had his bear spray and his high-powered hunting rifle along with him. Rudy loved going to the Yellow Mule's Loop Trail, which is a circuitous route winding through prime deer habitat, but it also leads through prime grizzly territory. Rudy had a client rent some ATVs for their deer hunt, and Rudy had tagged along to hang out. The father and son had walked off a short distance, spotted a deer, and eventually worked their way within shooting distance. After firing a shot at what they thought was a lethal spot on the deer's anatomy, they went down to the location where the deer was standing when they shot. Now, conventional wisdom says that when you track a wounded game animal, you mark your position from where you shot, then proceed to the location where the game animal was wounded. From there, you look for telltale information provided in the surroundings. When a deer is struck with a bullet or an arrow, blood isn't necessarily visible right away, but you can usually see a disturbed pattern in the game animal tracks. The tracks may veer sideways or it may stumble. That may be the location where the game animal was struck by the projectile. After locating the tracks of the wounded animal, blood or tissue evidence should start appearing along the tracks if you hit the game animal in a vital area. Sure enough, the father and son found a decent blood trail indicating their shot was true. It seemed to peter out after following the blood trail for some time. They lost the track and decided to go back up to the ATVs and tell Rudy about what had happened. As soon as they reached the ATV, they told Rudy about how the blood trail had just disappeared and asked him for advice. Rudy wasn't the kind of guy to let a wounded game animal go without doing his best to locate the carcass. Together, the three of them headed back down the trail in search of the blood trail. Rudy knew this area like the back of his hand. He took a familiar trail that led him to the area the other men described and found a blood trail. It turned out that it was a different deer than the one wounded by the hunters, and there were already some very dangerous hunters following this one. In the fall, bears of all sorts are in hyperphagia, which simply means they eat as much food wherever they can find it. They are trying to pack on fat for hibernation and can roam hundreds of miles over a week's time in search of it. They will do desperate things if they have not gained the requisite fat, and have been known to be most active and aggressive during this time of year. A few hundred yards away, Rudy saw an adult grizzly. He decided he would pull his rifle out, just in case he needed to defend his and his fellow hunters' lives. Rudy holed himself up behind a tree and could see a juvenile grizzly a little way away from him. By the time he redirected his attention back to the large grizzly bear, his entire situation had turned extremely dangerous. The giant grizzly, described as being a 10-foot mega grizzly, had closed in on Rudy. He was by himself, having separated from the father and son who were looking elsewhere for the wounded deer. The giant grizzly had suddenly reappeared danger close to Rudy. It isn't clear what brought the bear within such close proximity to the man so quickly. Perhaps his scent had drifted to it on a fickle breeze. But whatever the case, it was now closing in on him with its eyes fixed directly on him. Rudy raised his rifle to his shoulder and yelled, trying to get the bear to stop its charge. As it closed in on him, he knew he had only one option, and he took aim and squeezed the trigger of his hunting rifle. Expecting a loud report and a sturdy kick as the rifle discharged, Rudy was terrified when he only heard the click of the firing pin striking the primer. His hunting rifle had misfired, and at the most crucial time of his life. In the adrenaline-filled moments of a bear attack, victims' brains reportedly process thoughts and information very quickly. Rudy's first thought was to fall down and play dead, but he knew he wouldn't even be able to dive to the ground before the bear would be on him. In a last-ditch attempt at driving the bear off, Rudy swung his fist with all his might and struck the bear in the nose. Rudy's punch bounced off of the grizzly's nose as if it didn't connect. The bear reached out its jaws and clamped them onto Rudy's face like some kind of predatory kiss of death. The single bite from the grizzly's jaws shattered Rudy's lower jaw, and with one shake of its head, his entire lower jaw was torn from his face. Along with Rudy's jaw came a portion of his trachea, which is the cartilage tube we use to breathe. The enraged grizzly began clawing at Rudy's chest cavity, slicing through bones, skin, and flesh with very little resistance. With Rudy's chest torn wide open, the grizzly moved its attack down to his right leg. It bit his leg several times, opening up huge puncture wounds from which his blood poured onto the ground around him. During the attack, Rudy's body was being tossed around like a pillow at a teenager's slumber party. The grizzly then clamped its jaws onto his left bicep and drove its 2-inch-long canines clean through his skin and muscle, opening up several more huge puncture wounds. Now, in prior episodes, we have discussed what really happens when any bear bites a human being. They don't simply clamp down until their teeth come together. They drive their canines through the flesh and use their body mass and strength to pull the flesh away. This nearly always creates a wound cavity beneath the skin that can fill with infection and at least bruise the tissue. If this were a horror movie, you would expect to see the victim lose consciousness, but Rudy stayed conscious through the entire attack. He wasn't a limp body being tossed around during the attack, but chose to fight for his life, yelling, kicking, and punching the grizzly the entire time. A short way around the mountain, the father and son had heard Rudy's screams and the bear's roars. They arrived at the attack scene while the bear was still mauling Rudy, but hesitated to fire their rifle as they didn't want to hit him. They did manage to shoot the bear one time before they grabbed rocks and began pelting the bear as they yelled, trying to run it off. For some reason, the rocks worked. The bear turned around and disappeared into the forest, for now. As they approached Rudy's side, they could see he was near death's door. They fortunately discovered they had cell service. They retrieved their cell phone and reached out to emergency responders for immediate medical attention for Rudy. While waiting for the paramedics to respond, the father and son continually asked Rudy if he was okay. He was missing so much of his face, all he could do was lift his hand and give them an affirmative thumbs up in response. Given the amount of pain and trauma Rudy had just experienced, it seems a medical miracle that he didn't pass out or at least go into shock. The hunters waited with him until they heard the unmistakable sound of the Gallatin County Life Flight helicopter entering the valley. Along with the Life Flight paramedics, the GCSS Air, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Law Enforcement, U.S. Forest Service Law Enforcement as well, and the Gallatin County Sheriff's deputies all responded to Rudy's attack scene. Rudy's route to medical help was met with some confusion. During the attack, he had sustained a complete removal of his lower jaw, partial removal of his trachea, a collapsed lung from the bear tearing open his chest, and numerous other gashes and puncture wounds from the grizzly's claws and teeth. They knew he needed urgent life-saving medical care, but his wounds had to have approached the support limitations of every hospital in the vicinity. At the Bozeman Health Deaconess Regional Medical Center, Rudy underwent surgery to stabilize his condition. Medical professionals there performed a tracheostomy, which is an incision into the trachea to allow air to enter the trachea from an unobstructed pathway. From there, Rudy was flown to the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he is currently recuperating in the intensive care unit at the time of this video creation. The most recent updates on Rudy's condition indicate that he is off the ventilator now and is doing better. He recently underwent the first of many reconstructive surgeries to repair at least part of the damage done to his face. He reportedly even walked around a bit at the hospital. His daughter indicated that plans to remove one of his fibulas from his lower leg to recreate his lower jaw eventually. For now, he will have a metal plate inserted to replace his jaw for the short term. From the time he was attacked to when he arrived at the hospital in Bozeman, Rudy had been horribly mangled but managed to stay alert and aware for 2 hours. In response to Rudy's attack, authorities have closed the area around Yellow Mule Trail System to any foot traffic and have initiated a search for the giant grizzly bear. A GoFundMe account has been opened up if you would like to help Rudy offset some of his medical bills, and it is linked to in a pinned comment below this video. A few of Rudy's photos have been posted on my Patreon linked below, so if you want to check them out, they are available. If this were the end of this episode, it would be plenty, but I have some more information on a follow-up regarding the episode about Amy Adams's fatal grizzly attack on July 22nd, just about 50 miles south of Rudy's. Just west of West Yellowstone, a sow and cub grizzly had been breaking into cabins and homes in search of food. She had entered through windows and devoured dog food and any other food items she could find. The sow had a single cub that would accompany her during her home invasions. The sow and cub were apprehended after complaints were filed by the residents in the area. DNA evidence was pulled from both grizzlies and compared to the DNA evidence pulled from the scene of Amy's attack. The samples were compared favorably. The same sow was also found to have attacked a man in Idaho 3 years ago near Henry's Lake. Both grizzlies were positively identified as the bears who killed Amy Adamson and were immediately euthanized. In the last month, at least 4 close encounters have been reported to authorities by outdoorsmen. All of the encounters in which the bears were killed were deemed self-defense and the victims were not cited for any violations. Dan Springer, Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy, encourages people who decide to venture into the forests to plan for contingencies. A cell phone that worked and received a signal was integral to saving Rudy's life in this episode, and many other instances of similar occurrences have also been documented. First aid and trauma kits are essential as well. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks issued a statement declaring that Montana is bear country. They state that grizzly populations are increasing in density and are becoming more widespread. The likelihood of people encountering grizzlies will increase in occurrence and frequency. Wow, what an episode. After reviewing the facts surrounding this attack, I am left with a few questions for you. What would you do if you found yourself between 2 different grizzly bears while tracking a wounded deer? Do you plan to put a cell phone into your backpack next time you venture into the forest? What other defensive tools do you recommend for a person to use to defend themselves in addition to bear spray and a high-powered rifle? What factors can you identify that led to Rudy's survival? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to familiar territory, the eastern slope of the Canadian Rocky Mountains in south-central Alberta, Canada. The area around Wyperus is perhaps the world's current hotbed for grizzly bear attacks. The rolling hills of the Canadian Rocky Mountain foothills invite outdoor enthusiasts of varied interests. Hunters, hikers, campers, loggers, fishermen, and other adventurers are seeking the beauty, resources, and freedom more now than ever before. The forests here are packed with pine, fir, spruce, and aspen trees interrupted by stands of willows and berry bushes along the water sources in the area. Common animals in this area include deer, elk, and moose, and you might even see sheep and goats on the higher peaks to the west. The dominant predators in the area include coyotes, wolves, cougars, black bears, and grizzly bears. It seems that the grizzly bears here are the predatory species that are increasing in their confrontations with human beings. In many of the locations we discuss on this channel, a shortage of food is often a contributing factor to bear attacks, but in this episode, it is actually an abundance of food that does so. On the afternoon of July 19, 2016, 25-year-old Laura Hayworth and her husband James were enjoying sunbathing at Trapper's Campground positioned along the Ghost River. I know what you are thinking. Why do so many of these attacks happen in places with creepy or strange names? In some of the locations of the bear attacks we discuss, the appearance of a mountain shaped like a bear tooth, or named after something with a malevolent sound could be a coincidence, but maybe not. James and Laura had put some thought into their camping trip, at least enough to bring bear spray along with them. They had even practiced dispensing it just in case they may need to. As James and Laura basked in the sunshine just above an embankment along the river, she noticed a rustling in the bushes just a few meters behind them. Laura glanced over and saw something grayish, brown in color moving among the bushes and assumed it was wolves. She stood to her feet and told James to get up. She informed him that she thinks she sees a couple of wolves. James stood to his feet just in time to get a brief glimpse of 2 grizzly bear cubs. As soon as he did so, his vision was filled with the shape of the biggest grizzly bear he had ever seen, emerging quickly from the bushes only 8 feet from him and his wife. As the bear thundered toward the couple, she let out a roar that shook their bones. She growled and roared as she came at them in fear they were a threat to her cubs. The bear closed in on them so quickly that James had no time to react. Both James and Laura fumbled with the safety cap on their bear spray, but it appeared to be jammed. The bear had bore down on them so quickly that they had no time to properly dispense the spray. At a distance of only a few feet, even if they had managed to operate the bear spray correctly, it would not have been able to disseminate the cloud of irritant in an effective manner. The only thing they could have hoped for was a direct shot in her eyes and nose, but they were not able to complete that. Terror filled James as the attack scene from the movie The Revenant flashed through his mind. He thought he was dead, no doubt about it. He knew there was no way he could avoid her. She bowled him over and took him to the ground. Her immense size and weight forced the reality of the futility of resistance into James's mind. James scrambled back to his feet and started yelling at the bear. She returned to him and knocked him down once again. The sow was running back and forth between him and Laura, briefly confused about who posed a greater danger. James' brain was thinking very quickly, trying to process how to handle and escape from the danger posed by the enraged sow. He quickly told Laura to jump into the river, and he began running toward its banks himself. Just as James reached the river shore, he felt the enormous impact of the sow tackling him from behind. The sow had slammed him down onto the edge of the river and was standing over him with her front paws on the back of his thighs. The only thought racing through James's mind was that he was a dead man. This sow had knocked him down and sent him flying through the air, crashing onto the rocks 3 times now in a matter of a few seconds. She was now holding him under water, which would cause him to drown in a matter of a minute or so. This was clearly not a sow looking only to make sure her cubs were safe, but one that wanted to exterminate any threat to them. Whenever bears attack a prey animal in the water, they are frequently witnessed pulling it into deeper water by the neck or back. Then they climb onto it and force its nose or head underwater, utilizing the water to drown their prey. James was now feeling the same urgency as so many moose, deer, or elk may have experienced from a bear attack in water. Suddenly he felt the sow's weight shift and get off of his thighs. He emerged from the water to see the sow now chasing after Laura. Laura was smaller than James, and the bear knocked her down with just as much force. Laura lifted her hands to her face as she screamed in terror, hoping to ward off the bear's jaws from crushing her skull. James again scrambled back to his feet and sprinted toward the bear and his wife. He watched as the bear stood over Laura's outstretched hands as the bear clamped down on Laura's wrist. It began to dash toward the bushes, with Laura bouncing along the ground, in tow. As James gained ground on the bear, dragging his wife, the bear glanced over and saw him. It immediately let go of Laura's wrist and disappeared into the bushes to find her cubs. At this point, James wasn't sure what damage had been done during the lightning-fast bear attack to himself, nor his wife. He ran over to Laura's side and dragged her away from the edge of the bushes. He had hoped the bear would realize the distance between them was safe enough to gather her cubs and flee the area. As James looked up the slope, searching for the bears, he could see the sow and cubs scampering up the hillside. The couple discussed how they could get out of the area without causing another altercation with the sow and cubs. They began making their way along the river shore to a clearer location with bushes. They made noise and yelled as they went, so the sow would know where they were. A little way down the valley, a ranch hand at the Lazy H Ranch, Coleman Blair was helping bring in some hay. He heard the commotion from the attack and looked upstream to see James emerging from the river and Laura underneath the bear as it chewed on her. He usually carried his rifle whenever he went to work, but for some reason he left it at home on this day. By the time he arrived at James and Laura's location, the bear had made its way across the river and was emerging on the opposite bank. In a matter of minutes, James and Laura heard a man's voice yelling in reply to their cries for help. Up at the top of the cliff, they could see 2 men, one with a red shirt and the other with a dark shirt. James and Laura yelled, "Help! Help!" and told them there was a bear nearby. The 2 men indicated they knew of the bear and could see that it had departed the immediate area. James and Laura could see one of the men scrambling down the cliff toward them as the other stood watch from above to keep an eye on the sow's location. Blair ran down a large embankment towards the scene. The bear had moved away to the other side of the river by the time he reached James and his wife. He could see Laura's wrist was clearly broken due to its misshapen appearance. She had several deep bite wounds, scrapes, and cuts from being dragged across the rocky ground. James didn't have any bite wounds, but was scraped and bruised from the encounter. He also had an indelible bear paw-shaped bruise on his hamstring from where the sow stood on top of him at the riverbank. Blair stated later that when you see someone getting chewed on by a grizzly, you really can't just stand around. Due to his response, a follow-up attack by the sow may have been avoided. As soon as Blair had reached the couple's location, the three of them began making their way back up the steep embankment. He stated later that Laura was very shaken up by the experience and was chewed up pretty badly. As soon as they had reached the top, James dashed off to fetch the vehicle and rush his wife to get medical attention. He jumped into the vehicle and peeled out toward his wife, sending dirt flying as he went. Blair helped load Laura into the vehicle, and she and James quickly disappeared back down the road in a cloud of dust. A short distance down the dirt road, an ambulance pulled into view. The couple skidded to a stop, and the paramedics went to work on Laura. They began to assess her injuries and bandage them according to severity. They also radioed in for a medical helicopter team to respond for urgent care for Laura. The helicopter arrived at their location a short while later. The entire time the paramedics worked on Laura, she pled for them to tend to her husband, worried that he was also injured by the angry sow. They loaded Laura into the helicopter and flew her to the nearest hospital while James drove himself there in their vehicle. Later, James stated that people need to understand that animals must be respected. He continued to acknowledge that if the sow had wanted to tear them limb from limb, she would have done so. He accepted her behavior as her way of saying, "These are my cubs, get away," and is grateful that the outcome wasn't worse. An inspector with the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Branch indicated that bear attacks in the Waiparous area aren't that rare anymore. He stated that they have seen a half-dozen bear attacks within the last few years. The attacks have ranged from bluff charges to painful bites to serious maulings. Authorities took clothing from James and Laura to try to pull DNA from the sow's slobber that may have been present on the clothes. They plan to analyze it in an attempt to link the sow with any future problems they may have with her. When it comes to a sow defending her cubs, authorities are always cautious in reacting with lethal force. They stated that grizzlies play an integral part of the ecosystem, and removing one has ripple effects on many other animals and plants in the area. They also plan to close the area for a lengthy amount of time to allow the sow and her cubs to make their way through it. Biologists indicated that this year's wild berry yield in the Waiparous area was a bumper crop compared to adjacent ecosystems. The plentiful food source brought grizzlies from miles around to the location to feast on the sugary, nutritious delicacies to help them gain weight needed for hibernation. This food source is particularly important to sows and cubs, given there is no annual reliable salmon runs around there. After reviewing the details of this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think the attack was a territorial attack or a defensive one? Could this attack have been avoided if James and Laura hadn't stood to investigate the rustling in the bushes near them? Would a firearm have changed the outcome of this attack, or did it happen far too fast? Would you expect to be attacked by a protective sow when you are sunbathing on a river embankment? As an added challenge, let's see who can list the most contributing factors that led to Laura's survival. I will be glad. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the small town of Grand Isle, about 325 kilometers northwest of Prince George. It is in central British Columbia, Canada, along Babine Lake, and is one of the best locations in the world to view grizzly bears during the sockeye salmon runs from August to October each year. The Fulton River Project near Grand Isle is a man-made salmon spawning bed, with the first channel being constructed in 1965 and the second in 1971. These channels are about 5 miles long and allow sockeye fry to take advantage of the ideal rearing potential in upstream Babine Lake. Annually, these channels have the capacity to produce 135,000 adult salmon, as well as provide jobs to area residents. About 2,000 people visit the channels each year to watch the grizzly bears fight for prime salmon fishing locations and gather the calories they need for survival. When the grizzlies show up here, they take part in a massive cycle of nutrients that originates here and extends into the Pacific Ocean, where the majority of the salmon life cycle occurs. The fry and smolt spend the first 3 years of their life in the confines of fresh water before making their way downstream to the ocean. While feeding in the ocean, sockeye salmon can grow up to about 2.5 feet in length and up to around 15 pounds. After 2 years in the ocean, they are approaching the end of their life cycle, which culminates in them making their way up the exact same watersheds from which they came, and frequently returning to the same gravel beds from which they hatched to breed the next generation. Bears, wolves, and other animals help circulate the nutrients to the areas surrounding the streams by carrying the salmon carcasses into the brush, thereby fertilizing the plants there. Any disruption in this 5-year cycle in the important source of protein, fat, and nutrients that bears need can disrupt or stress grizzly populations. As far as nutrients that grizzlies get from salmon, here is a quick breakdown. They typically prefer the brain and roe, which are the eggs, as well as the skin of salmon. Each tablespoon of roe offers bears or any consumer about 2 grams of protein and 1 gram of carbohydrates. Each female salmon produces between 600 to 800 eggs per pound of body weight. That means a single female salmon, called a hen, weighing 10 pounds can produce between 6,000 to 8,000 eggs for her reproductive life cycle. The skin and brain of the salmon offer important sources of fats and vitamins as well, but the roe is the bear's big payoff when it comes to salmon. The geography around Grand Isle is mountainous, with valleys lined by dense stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, with a thick forest floor of alder, willows, and berry bushes. Mule deer, elk, bison, and moose are common forest dwellers you may see in this area. Predators here include coyotes, mountain lions, wolves, black bears, and grizzly bears. Each of these predators balances on an ecological food system which overlaps in part with each other. At around 7 a.m. on September 29, 2021, a 70-year-old photographer, whom we will call Jack, was vying for position to take pictures of the grizzlies as they fished for salmon. Getting a good photograph of a grizzly while it is fishing is an amazing and captivating pursuit that can lead to an image representing 2 successful recovery stories. Both salmon and grizzlies have been protected and growing since preservation efforts started around the middle of the last century. As Jack walked down an access road that went along the Fulton River project, he searched for a perch to observe the bears. This project diverts water from the adjacent Fulton River and directs it along a winding series of engineered gravel breeding areas called redds. All along the river, grizzlies gather to compete to catch the salmon as they migrate toward the redds to finish their life cycle. Grizzlies do not normally tolerate close proximity with each other or humans, but due to the abundance of food here, they can be found in high numbers. They are so focused on finding and defending their location to catch fish that photographers and onlookers will frequently find themselves within a few yards of bears without much threat. This creates an illusory atmosphere in many human visitors' minds. They sometimes slip into a relaxed mindset, believing the bears to disregard human presence. The dense undergrowth along the Fulton River provides very good cover for any animal there. The grizzlies navigate the area on a bear-established trail system which weaves its way along the banks and periodically emerges onto human trails and roads.
As Jack walked along the access road with his camera and gear in hand, he approached one of these junctions at a very inopportune time.
Unbeknownst to Jack, a grizzly was just leaving the riverside along a trail and converging on his travel route. Surprising a bear, even one with a belly full of salmon roe, is never a good idea. As soon as the bear saw the man within just a few yards of itself, its fight or flight reaction took over, and the fight reaction of a bear is always dangerous to a human. If you surprise me, you might just get punched in the nose, but a bear doesn't have fists, so you can imagine the equivalent reaction. The bear blitzed the man in a blur of brownish fur and roaring teeth. Jack held out his arm as a means to maintain separation between his body and the angry bear. In an attack that lasted only a few seconds, the grizzly clamped its jaws onto Jack's arm and tossed its head back and forth, tearing holes the size of quarters into his forearm and upper arm. The attack consisted of several bites in rapid succession before the bear dashed off into the bush. I may be dating myself by saying this, but some grizzlies are slightly smaller than a Volkswagen Bug from the 1960s, and you may be dating yourself by understanding my meaning. Most people think an animal the size of a small vehicle would be easy to spot and avoid, but even a large bear can move with amazing speed. Before Jack could process the events that transpired, the bear was gone, and he was lying on his back along the access road. It wasn't but a few minutes before other photographers and visitors in the area arrived at Jack's side after hearing him yelling during the attack. They could see the enormous holes in his arm gashed by the bear's teeth and comforted him while calling for medical assistance. Jack was loaded up and flown to a hospital in Prince George, a little more than 150 miles away. Once there, his condition was stabilized and his wounds were sutured closed. His injuries were not life-threatening, but were imparted in such a rapid manner that a prolonged attack may have threatened his life or may have cost him his arm. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the nearby town of Houston were sent out to respond to Jack's grizzly attack. They worked in conjunction with the Conservation Officer Service in the investigation. Given that the bear and Jack met along a brush-covered roadside, the investigators deemed the attack as a strictly defensive attack and decided that no further action would be taken against the grizzly. It was decided the bear was not acting as a nuisance to humans and would not be killed or relocated. The Conservation Officer Services issued warnings to visitors about surprising bears and encouraged the public to take precautions against it. Packing bear spray and making a lot of noise may prevent confrontations and attack when traveling through bear country. They encourage people to stay aware of their surroundings and travel in groups as much as possible. Conservation officers here have received an average of 138 calls each month in BC in the month of September each year. Only 32 of those calls required a response by an officer. Over this time frame, only 3 grizzlies have had to be killed due to danger or nuisance to humans. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it is wise to reintroduce grizzlies into their former habitat in areas without re-establishing salmon runs which helps them survive? How do you think Jack may have avoided this attack? Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? Would you feel safe walking along an access road near a river lined with giant, hungry grizzly bears? Do you run away or punch at people when they jump scare you? I will be happy to read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode whisks us away to the Cabinet Mountains, which cross the Idaho and Montana borders. The elevation of this mountain range varies between 2,000 feet along the Kootenai River in Idaho and 8,740 feet on the range's highest point, Snowshoe Peak. The Cabinet Yaak Mountain ecosystem covers about 2,600 square miles and has been labeled as a grizzly bear recovery zone, according to the Vital Ground Foundation website. In this mountain system, forests of hemlock, pine, fir, and spruce trees, with birch trees, grow along bodies of water. The primitive forests here are nearly pristine and have been well preserved, making it a great place to learn about the 50 grizzly bears that roam the mountain range. Deer, elk, and moose are common prey for the predators here, which include cougars, wolves, coyotes, and black bears, as well as grizzly bears. Along the drainage of Portman Creek, just south of Libby, 28-year-old Amber Cornack was tasked with checking the grizzly hair collection stations. These stations are built out of barbed wire, which snags the hair as bears rub against it. This allows for the compilation of a DNA database of bears in the area and is critical to studying the bears. Wayne Cassworm worked as a biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and had hired Amber for temporary seasonal employment. Amber had graduated from Oregon State University in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife management. The study of animals was her passion, and she had hopped from job to job, seeking to fulfill her passion and turn it into a permanent career. Amber's assignment required that she spend hours hiking remote trails all alone. She had completed specialized training on how to be safe and how to handle animal attacks while in the field. She had even completed training in similar disciplines as a 16-year-old hunter years before. Amber grew up in Michigan, but had globetrotted with employment assignments in wildlife agencies in Oregon, Missouri, Florida, and Idaho. She made Montana her permanent home, no matter where her assignments took her. On May 17, 2018, Amber had been in the field for 3 days. At around 11 a.m., she just pulled a bundle of hair from one of the barbed wire snags set up for that purpose. She had 3 or 4 more snags to retrieve samples from and was hiking near Portman Creek, which was surging with loud spring runoff. Typically, Amber would use a whistle to alert bears or other animals to her presence in their territory, or she would stomp her feet as she hiked and clap her hands loudly as she walked between snags. She was well trained in safety measures and practiced them with discipline. Amber wasn't carrying a firearm, but she was carrying her bear spray as she completed her hair collection duties. At one point in her hike, Amber heard a loud and very close woof to her left. She quickly glanced in the direction of the noise and could see a huge grizzly bear, only 12 feet from her. She knew this was a critical point in the confrontation, as she had clearly surprised the bear as much as it had surprised her. She knew the grizzly would either attack her or bolt in the opposite direction, and hoped for the latter. Amber knew that given the proximity of the run-in, her best option was to play dead. She turned to her right and dropped to the ground in the nearest bush, hoping that her backpack might absorb any attack from the grizzly. By the time she did this, she could already feel the grizzly pressing into her back. She could feel a powerful slap from the grizzly bear on her back and its claws tearing into her arm. She reached down to her bear spray, which she had holstered on her hip, and flipped the safety guard off. That is when she felt the bear's teeth clamp onto the back of her skull. The back of her head was the easiest portion of her head to reach for the bear, so that is where it drove its teeth. The bear's canines pierced and fractured her skull, popping her bones and sending fragments of her bones into her brain. As the bear was trying to kill her, Amber defiantly stretched her left arm toward the bear with her bear spray in her hand. She pressed the button on the canister from point-blank range and doused the bear's nose, eyes, and mouth. The irritant also covered the area around Amber and affected her negatively as well. The bear was clearly deterred from continuing its attack on Amber at that point, and disappeared into the brush as quickly as it had appeared. She laid on the ground, trying to gather her senses for a moment. She wanted to make sure the bear had actually left and wouldn't return, so she remained still for a few moments afterward. Amber was carrying a special piece of safety equipment that we've discussed previously on this channel. She used her inReach by Garmin to request help immediately as she rinsed the bear spray from her eyes with her water bottle. She sipped some water and waited for the effects of the spray to wane. Amber slowly gathered her feet beneath her, mustering the courage to stand. As she lifted her head, she searched the brush to make sure the bear had not returned. She knew that bears make nearly no noise, and had not even seen what direction in which the bear had fled. Amber knew that she couldn't stay in bear country while she was injured, and hoped that help would find her before the bear would. She resolved the only situation for her was to try to walk the 2 miles back to her vehicle. As she briskly walked, she tried to assess the extent of her injuries. Her left ear was ringing, and her head hurt badly. Her hat slipped from her head while she was walking, and when she replaced it, she felt the back of her skull. The skin around the grizzly's bite was swollen and misplaced. She knew she had no time to examine it right now, so she bravely pressed on toward her vehicle. While she walked, Amber distracted herself by thinking of artifacts she might find on her hike out. She hoped she might find a nice moose antler shed the prior winter. She did everything she could to make as much noise as she walked to ensure any moose or bears in her area knew she was there. Amber briskly walked for the better part of an hour through snowfields and muddy points in the trail before she finally reached the safety of her truck. She was so comfortable that she had the forethought to stow her backpack before getting some water and pulling a snack from her backpack. Amber knew she needed to do something to slow the bleeding from the grizzly's bite on her head, so she took her sweater and wrapped it around her head. She avoided looking into the mirror so that she wasn't alarmed by the sight and seriousness of her wounds. After getting herself comfortable, Amber turned the key on her truck and began searching for anyone she could find. About 3 miles down the road, the rear license plate of a vehicle invigorated her. Amber honked the horn on her truck and waved her hand out of the window, trying to get the attention of the driver of the vehicle. Eventually, the driver pulled over, and Amber left her truck to chat with the man. She asked him if he could help her get to the hospital, and explained that she had her skull crushed by a grizzly bear. The man quickly agreed to help her and assisted her into his truck. Amber and her rescuer had scantly drove a mile down the road before they saw an ambulance pull into view. They'd been dispatched to answer her request for help sent earlier by her inReach device. The first responders quickly loaded her into the ambulance and began to administer medical care as they sped toward Highway 2. As soon as they reached the highway, Amber was loaded into a medical helicopter and was flown to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in Kalispell, Montana. Once she arrived at the medical center, she was informed that her recovery would take at least 3 months. Her follow-up treatment would take a year. After significant assessment, the grizzly's bite on her skull was not found to have severed any nerves, but did damage muscles in her neck and arm. Amber was found to have lost 95% of the hearing in her left ear. Undaunted as she was, Amber was told the doctor overseeing her treatment would not allow her to return to work immediately, so she was hired back to her former position with the Idaho Fish and Game while she healed. DNA analysis had to be completed to determine if it was a black bear or a grizzly bear that had attacked her. The attack had occurred so quickly that even Amber wasn't sure which species had been the culprit. Following her attack, she says she has even more respect for bears than she had before it. She maintains that this experience will make her a better bear manager and broaden her knowledge and experience from which to draw. After DNA evidence from her attack scene was analyzed, the bear that attacked Amber was found to be a 24-year-old male bear that had been captured previously in 2005. This bear had spent his entire life in the Cabinet Yaak Mountains, which Amber found fascinating. Amber stated that through her experience she had learned a lot about herself. She found it reassuring that she had defended herself and even assisted in her own rescue following her devastating attack. She indicates that she has no regrets following her bear attack. She states that she and the bear spooked each other and doesn't fault the bear for doing what it did to defend itself. Amber's grizzly bear attack was determined to be a defensive attack and no action was taken against the bear. It had no record of being a threat or nuisance to humans and was allowed to continue its life unabated. Amber says the bear spray absolutely saved her life. Due to her training on how to properly dispense it, its use was effective and was the determining factor in her survival. Well, I'm sure that you agree with me in my saying that Amber is the most beautiful and toughest bear researcher in the world. After reviewing the details of this attack, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it ironic that a bear researcher was attacked by a bear? Why do you think Amber wasn't issued a firearm for her protection? What could Amber have done to avoid this attack? Would you return to the field to research grizzly bears after having your skull crushed by one? I know I wouldn't. She's tougher than me. I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Canadian North, near Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. The geography here is mountains with thick forests of quaking aspen and larch. Grasses and berry bushes cover the ground in an emerald blanket. Common animals in this area include muskox, elk, caribou, sheep, and moose in the valleys, and mountain goats on the high peaks. Predators in this area include wolves, wolverines, cougar, black bears, and enormous grizzly bears. Field Johnson was a native big game guide in the territory just west of Whitehorse. He'd spent many years guiding hunters in harvesting game animals around his home and knew every nook and cranny where they could be found. He lived among the oxbows along Cracker Creek with its lush foliage and gentle slopes. In the spring of 1950, he knew he needed to replenish his stores of meat. The winter had cut his stores down as he managed through another harsh season. His preferred firearm was his trusty .30-30 rifle. It had helped him harvest animals that provided food for him as well as protected him from any threat that arose. Field decided he would go hunting for moose in the hills just above his home in Champaign, Yukon Territory, Canada. After rounding up his needed supplies, it wasn't long before Field had arrived at the promising moose hunting territory he most preferred. He'd left early in the morning, and since the long bright days of summer were still to come, the darkness of winter still cloaked the land from his vision. This wasn't anything new to Field, given he lived so far north. The winter time brings steady darkness for almost 5 months of the year. As the seasons change, this darkness gives way stubbornly to longer days, eventually leading to nearly full daylight for most hours of the days of summer. Navigating through the dark woods was just part of everyday life for people like Field, and was dealt with just as another hardship in an already hardscrabble existence. As he slipped through the brush and branches that were so promising for his desired moose meat, he scanned the shadows, hoping for a huge dark form to appear before him. As he turned his head in one direction, he felt himself thrown through the air, after a silent explosion of force had slammed into him. He tumbled several yards down the slope and lay still, unsure of what exactly had just happened to him. It was but a few seconds before the source of this blow emerged from up the hill. He immediately knew it was a huge grizzly, so common in the area, and froze, hoping that the bear would leave him. Years of experience with grizzlies told him that if he moved, showed signs of life, or tried to fight back, it may only invite a more violent impartation of force from the bear. After approaching Field, the bear swatted at him and clawed him. It watched him for any signs of life, and he knew if he didn't move, he may be able to convince it he was dead. After clawing the man up severely, it scraped up sticks, leaves, and mud from all around him as the hunter lay flat on his stomach. He fought the urge to look directly at the bear and focused on playing dead. With any luck, he could convince the bear that its powerful initial blow had killed him, and he worked hard to lay still and silent. After the bear had spent the better part of an hour scraping duff over Field's body, it padded around him, sniffing and watching him. Soon it disappeared, and he could only hope it had left for good. He knew that the bear had buried him in hopes of coming back and consuming him later. The question was, what time would it return? Field could feel his blood oozing from wounds all over his body, and felt the pain of each of his wounds as his adrenaline began to fade. He hadn't heard the bear in some time, and thought it may be a good time to try to escape before the bear returned. He slowly pulled himself from beneath the foliage and debris. Field stumbled as he regained his bearings and searched for a direction to flee. What Field didn't know was that the giant grizzly had buried him, then laid down over its latest meal claim to rest. As soon as he stood to his feet, the grizzly roared from the nearby bushes and attacked him once again. The grizzly cuffed him with each of its paws back and forth several times. Each swat from the bear's paws tore clothing, skin, and muscle tissue with ease. The bear bit huge holes in his legs and arms and used its claws to shear gashes into his flesh. As the bear continued to tear Field limb from limb, consciousness faded and his body went limp. With Field unconscious, the bear undoubtedly thought he was finally dead. It bit onto his lower leg and dragged him for about a mile, with his lifeless body bouncing over rocks and through stabbing brush. After it was convinced that it had moved Field to a more preferred location, it again began to scrape duff, mud, and sticks over his body to bury him in a second food cache. By late afternoon, Field had regained consciousness once again. The wounds in his body had drained him of vital fluids, and his thirst was immense. His body was battered and torn brutally, and every part of him ached from the violence the grizzly had imparted on him. Field knew that he would not survive a night in the frigid forest after being brutalized in such a violent way. He would have to gamble on pulling himself from the duff the bear had buried him beneath once again. If the bear returned to him this time, it would certainly be the death of him. Field carefully and cautiously crawled from the mound and tottered to his feet. He was too exhausted to look around and confirm the bear wasn't closing in on him for a final attack. The man knew that all he could do was stumble in the direction of the busiest place near him, the Alaska Highway. By this point, Field was covered with sticks, mud, and coagulated blood from head to toe. He stumbled his way through several miles of forest and finally climbed the shoulder of the highway he hoped would be his point of eventual rescue. As he rested on the side of the highway, a vehicle appeared in the distance. As it neared him, Field waved frantically, and the driver pulled over. Finding a man in such condition in the middle of nowhere might be enough of a fright to send most people down the road after stomping on the accelerator, but this man helped Field into his vehicle. The driver immediately pointed his vehicle toward the town of Whitehorse and the hospital that would provide medical help to the injured man. While at the hospital, Field learned that the bear attack had done a great deal of damage to his body, even more than the pain had indicated. An assessment of his injuries revealed that both of his arms and several ribs were broken by the bear. His scalp was completely misplaced and hung to his head by a thin piece of skin. While dragging him, the bear had chewed up his feet severely, and huge gashes in his thighs were torn by its claws. Field spent 2 months in the hospital before being released. Upon his release, Field immediately returned to the site of his attack in search of his rifle. Incredibly, he managed to find it. Field didn't waste any time returning home, but immediately set out to find the bear who had so violently hunted and attacked him. He knew that the bear would not stop hunting and killing people, and that this bad bear had to die to prevent anyone else from suffering a similar fate. He returned to the area surrounding his grizzly bear attack, but no record could be found indicating that he was successful in avenging himself. Within a year, Field had wasted away in comparison to his form prior to the attack. His health had failed him, as his injuries were too taxing on his condition. I'm sure the mental trauma of experiencing such a violent and painful attack contributed to his demise. In his recounting of the attack, Field never indicated that he had seen cubs, nor had he smelled or seen a food cache. It can safely be assumed that this bear attack was a predatory bear attack, given the nature and severity of Field's injuries. There is no record of what happened to the bear after its attack on Field. It is assumed that it was not killed by anyone, and died of natural causes at the end of its life cycle. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think it was too great a risk for Field to enter the forest while it was dark? Why do you think the bear left Field after burying him the second time? Was this attack a predatory or defensive attack? Would you have returned to the same place to get revenge on a grizzly bear that surprised you in a violent attack? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a residential backyard for not one, but two different bear attacks, a few years apart. In Muncie Creek Township, Pennsylvania, black bears are becoming too common in human areas. The township is low in elevation at around 400 feet high in the valley and largely developed into an urban area ringed by acreages. It lies in Lycoming County, which is dotted with small townships and wild woodlands. The hills surrounding the area are covered by dense and protective forests, nearly devoid of roads or trails. They are almost impenetrable, with tangles of underbrush so thick that visibility is under a few yards in most places. The stands of berry bushes here are diverse and very common. Delicious and nutritious sources of sugar and vitamins, such as blueberries, blackberries, boysenberries, and raspberries, are some of the most plentiful, just to name a few. The larger animals here include white-tailed deer and elk, with smaller animals consisting of raccoons, possums, hares, and cottontail rabbits. The predators here are scaled to the size of their prey. Smaller predators include shrews, weasels, foxes, bobcats, and coyotes, with the largest predator being the very common black bears of the area. On the evening time of December 12, 2018, Melinda LeBaron was enjoying her rented residence on Peach Orchard Road. She and her husband Sid had rented the home from landlord, neighbor, and friend Corinne Levan. Melinda was approaching 50 years old and enjoyed the home's rural location while still being near the amenities that Muncie Creek had to offer residents. She is a very petite woman weighing only 107 pounds and is spunky well beyond her tiny size. Her constant companion was her 2-year-old Pekingese Chihuahua mixed dog, ironically named Bear. As Melinda felt the urge to take a smoke break from the evening chore duties, she called to Bear and headed toward the back door of her home. Her backyard butted up to a large wood line and didn't have a fence. After opening the door, Bear streaked past her. Bear began growling and barking at something just around the corner of the house, and Melinda slowly walked over to investigate what was causing all of the commotion. Before she got to the corner of the home, her vision was filled with an enormous, angry black bear closing in on her faster than reaction would allow. Now, it wouldn't take a lot of force to knock Melinda off her feet, but that doesn't mean the bear held back. One of the few things Melinda remembers being able to visually process in the lightning-fast bear attack was seeing the bear's claws as it closed in on her. Melinda's only thought was that she was finished as she stared up at the bear from her back. The bear had taken her down by tripping her with its paws and was now standing over the top of her. It clamped its jaws on her head and raked parts of her scalp away from her skull. Melinda was in shock nearly instantly and didn't report hearing any flesh tearing or bones breaking, but was powerless to escape the speed and aggression of the bear. As Melinda did her best to protect herself, the bear bit and clawed her head, hip, and back as it viciously attacked her. As she rolled and yelled, it bit and clawed her toward the edge of the woods in front of her house. At several points in the attack, Melinda yelled at the bear to stop it as the pain of each bite seared through her body, but the black bear would not relent. Each time she rolled to her stomach, the bear would swat and bite her, forcing her to roll further from her house. It alternately bit onto Melinda's hip and shoulder to carry her a short distance until the pair was just off the shoulder of the road, across from Melinda's house. It continued to maul Melinda, peeling her pants and undergarments from her body during the attack. Suddenly the bear stopped attacking Melinda and sat down beside her. Melinda was terrified as she thought of what was next to come. She figured the bear would either continue to carry her into the woods farther or eat her where she lay. She tried to remain as still as possible, hoping the bear would lose interest.
Over the course of several minutes, the bear sat there beside Melinda, panting and staring at her as she lay still. After a short time, she reached over and grabbed a nearby stick. She threw the stick a short distance into the nearby bushes, hoping to change the bear's focus. After watching the stick hit the bushes, the bear stood to her feet and slowly wandered off back into the forest. Melinda remained still until she was convinced the bear had actually left. She peered around with her face toward the ground, searching for the bear in her peripheral vision. Once she was certain the bear was no longer near her, Melinda began to assess her injuries briefly. She could feel her ear dangling from the skin and a large piece of her scalp completely missing. The pain in her shoulder and hip was excruciating, as each location had several puncture wounds from the bear's teeth made when it carried her 90 yards from her backyard. She was completely discombobulated and crawled backward to a small tree. 2 of its branches were within her reach, so she used them to pull herself up off the ground. She glanced around trying to get her bearings. Across the street she could see the glow of her front porch light and began crawling back toward her home. When she realized she was too injured to continue, she called out to her neighbor Corrine. She came running to Melinda's side and helped her into her home. First responders arrived immediately and transported Melinda to Geisinger Medical Institute in Danville. She spent 2 weeks in the trauma unit in critical condition with major injuries to her head, hip, and shoulder. The bear had torn a significant portion of her scalp, as well as bit her hip and shoulder several times, causing major tissue damage. She received skin grafts on her forehead, and a medical drain was placed just under her skin. Melinda underwent 9 more operations in the few weeks following her attack. Her dog Bear suffered a broken rib, a punctured lung, and a gash on his stomach, but fully recovered shortly after the attack. After 2 months of medical attention, Melinda was released to finish her healing at her home. As her ride pulled up to her home, she could see a huge "Welcome Home" sign stretched across the front of her house. After her attack, a search for the bear yielded 2 cubs, but no sow bear. The authorities abandoned the search, assuming the bear had fled the area. But that isn't the end of the story. On the evening of Saturday, October 17, 2020, Melinda once again went to her backyard with Bear for a potty break. Suddenly, a black blur shot out of the bushes and headed toward Bear. Melinda was terrified. The most traumatizing event of her life was occurring once again. As soon as Bear saw the black bear running toward him, he turned tail and headed straight for Melinda. I am sure he was hoping she would protect him, but Bear would not make it to the safety of his owner's arms. Just as Bear reached the porch steps, the black bear pinned him to the ground with its immense paws. Sid quickly snapped loose a curtain rod that was above the porch. He used it to poke and prod the bear away from his wife and himself. After he realized that the bear wasn't going to release Bear, the past trauma forced them to seek their own safety first. They managed to rush inside the back door and slam it shut, leaving Bear to face the bear's wrath alone. Bear did not survive this attack. The black bear took his life in the violent and ruthless attack on the little dog. Melinda and Sid believe it was the same bear that killed their dog and attacked Melinda a few years prior. They believe something is wrong with this bear and that it seems to have a vendetta for them, or at least it had one against their dog Bear. The Pennsylvania Game Commission contends that it was likely a different black bear in each attack on the LeBarons. They cite the fact that there were no cubs present when Bear was attacked, as there were in Melinda's attack. They admit there is just no way to know for sure. Given that sow black bears do not have cubs every year, the fact that there were no cubs present does not necessarily preclude the possibility of both attacks being conducted by the same bear. The Game Commission did place a culvert trap in a field near the LeBarons' home. They also notified residents in the area to remove their bird feeders and put away their trash cans to keep bears from roaming into the neighborhood. There was no record of the trap catching any bears. According to records that date back to colonial times, there has never been a fatal black bear attack on any human beings in Pennsylvania, but Melinda's was very close to being the first. If it had happened even a few decades before, the outcome may have been very different. In the state of Pennsylvania, officials estimate that there are around 20,000 black bears spread across 46,055 square miles. This puts bear concentrations at about 1 black bear per 2 square miles. That is a very high density and maybe the highest density of black bears in the United States. According to authorities, there have been 30 black bear attacks in the state in the last 30 years. After reviewing the facts surrounding these attacks, I have a few questions for you. Do you think both attacks were done by the same black bear? What more could Melinda have done to avoid either of these attacks? Why do you think Bear was such a prime target for black bears near the LeBarons' home? Do you believe the black bear would have tried to attack Melinda if Sid hadn't been home during the second attack? I will be glad to read and answer your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a familiar place to viewers of this channel. If you think Montana is a hotbed of bear attacks now, back in the 1800s it was even more so. Just a few miles north of Butte is a small dot of a town called Warm Springs. Back then it was even less of a dot than the dot it is now. The geography here is steep rocky mountains with valleys filled with thick stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees. All along the waterways of the area, aspen trees and willow bushes blot out any chance to see for more than a few yards. Serviceberries, chokecherries, and wild currants abound in this dense screen of scrub. In this area, white-tailed deer, elk, and moose are plentiful, but back in the 1800s, the most dangerous animals were bears. Peter Hellstrom was a recent immigrant from Sweden. He had heard of the opportunities the U.S. offered immigrants and envisioned finding a way to establish a ranch here. His main goal was to bring his beautiful wife over after he bought some land, and together they would make a family. He arrived in America in mid-July of 1888 and immediately saw wanted posters offering enough reward money to get him well along on his goal to ranch ownership. By fall, Hellstrom had partnered with two other Swedes in the area to form a bounty hunting party. Hellstrom had offered Christian Jorgensen and Andrew Peterson a big chunk of the money he'd hoped to earn after the optimistic young men killed the bear on the wanted poster, but they refused the offer. They would accompany their friend and wanted him to keep the money to fulfill his dream. Herds of local stockmen around Warm Springs, Montana were being harassed by a giant cinnamon bear. This bear would attack area livestock, eat his fill, then disappear before the ranch hands could kill it. Hunters would follow its track, but the bear always managed to stay a step ahead of them. More than a few hunters, motivated by the reward money, returned from the mountains disappointed, exhausted, and empty-handed. The bear was harder to find than a black cat in a cave. The area ranchers eventually raised the reward for the black bear's hide to $100, and that was all the motivation Hellstrom and his friends needed. The Swedes headed out in the morning of September 15th from Warm Springs and went north toward the foothills of Mount Powell. After the hunters crossed a pasture called Peterson's Field, a pair of huge bear tracks were found, pressed deeply into the muddy soil. The sheer size of this bear was enough to rile the hunters up, and they quickly set out to follow the tracks. As the bear's tracks meandered toward Mount Powell, the hunters followed it through all kinds of brush and bushes, over barren hills and through forests. The tracks were a day or so old, and were spaced such that the men knew the bear was moving slowly. It had killed a cow a few days prior, and was still full of the meat, on which it had gorged itself. After a few more hours of following the bear tracks, the men could see that they were now very fresh. The bear had apparently laid up for a day's rest, which allowed the men to make up a lot of ground as they followed it. Hellstrom took the lead with his friends following close behind him. They pushed their way through brush and reeds, while following the giant bear tracks. Once Hellstrom had looked up, he realized he had nearly walked right up to the giant bear. The surprised and angry bear immediately rose upright, while still squatted on its haunches. It swiped at the air between Hellstrom and it, only 10 feet away from the hunter. Hellstrom knew he likely had only a few seconds to react before the bear would disappear into the brush. He quickly raised his rifle to his shoulder and took aim. His rifle cracked as the ball seared its path toward the bear's chest. The ball ammunition from Hellstrom's gun had struck home, and the impact temporarily froze the bear. After the brief pause, the bear let out a low growl before disappearing into the brush, away from the men. Hellstrom, Jorgensen, and Peterson were excited to see the impact of the bullet, and energetically looked at each other before searching for a blood trail. This time Peterson took the lead as the group of hunters searched for the bear. Hellstrom brought up the rear of the pack as the men followed each spatter of blood found along the tracks. They could see the bear's tracks slowing as the distance between each impression grew shorter and shorter. With any luck, the giant bear would be piled up behind the next clump of brush. Little did the men know, the massive bear had doubled back and ran in a circle around its pursuers, and was now behind them. As Hellstrom pushed his way through the reeds and brush, he heard a short moan very near and behind him. Hellstrom backtracked a few steps and was blindsided by the big bear. Before Hellstrom could react, the bear swung one of its massive paws, tipped with long, sharp claws, across his face. The blow knocked him to his back and nearly severed his upper lip from his face. One of the bear's claws raked across his nose, ripping it from side to side. In the same motion, another one of the bear's claws ripped open a gash that went from Hellstrom's ear all the way down his neck and across his chest. Now looking up at the bear, Hellstrom tried to raise his rifle, but the bear growled as it opened its mouth over his face. The enraged bear wrapped its massive jaws across Hellstrom's cheekbones and bit down. After locking its jaws onto his head, it shook back and forth violently. Jorgensen and Peterson could see the bear as it stood over Hellstrom. They witnessed their friend as the bear clamped its jaws onto his face and shook him. They had plenty of opportunity to shoot the bear, but were too afraid that they may hit Hellstrom. They held their fire and watched as the bear released Hellstrom and stood over him, growling and staring menacingly. Just then Peterson saw a great opportunity to fire at the bear. He shouldered his rifle and fired a second lead ball into the bear. His shot struck the bear with a resounding smack. As soon as the ball shot struck the bear, it reared up on its hind legs. It towered over the men and was an awesome sight to behold. Suddenly the bear collapsed on top of Hellstrom. Neither the bear nor Hellstrom moved in the mass of bear and man. Peterson and Jorgensen ran over and grabbed a hold of the bear. They could hardly move the giant as its bulk completely covered Hellstrom. After rolling the bear off their friend, Jorgensen and Peterson were met with a gruesome sight. They could see that Hellstrom's scalp had been completely peeled toward the back of his skull. His skull cap was splintered, and beneath it was a mass of blood and tissue. They noted that jelly-like particles were visible in their friend's skull wounds. Jorgensen and Peterson knew that they had to get Hellstrom back to medical help as fast as possible. They gathered 2 long pine boughs and used their coats to complete the improvised litter for their friend. A faint heartbeat could be picked up by Hellstrom's friends. They packed Hellstrom out several miles back to Warm Springs. They knew Dr. Mussingbrod was a good doctor. Unfortunately for Hellstrom, the surgeon was not in the office and nowhere to be found. Jorgensen and Peterson borrowed a nearby wagon and quickly pointed their horses north 5 miles to the hospital at Deer Lodge. The Swedes brought Hellstrom to Sisters Hospital and put him under the care of Dr. A.H. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell could do very little for Hellstrom as his condition was so terrible. The medical staff cleaned Hellstrom's wounds and comforted him as he lay unconscious for a while. When he woke up, he whispered to the doctor and asked him if he was going to die through his torn lips. The doctor informed Hellstrom that he believed that the young man was going to die, and watched as he closed his eyes. Hellstrom continued to breathe in short, shallow breaths. Just before he passed away, Hellstrom opened his eyes and he said, "Well, I guess I killed that bear anyhow." Hellstrom was buried, and his widow was sent a letter explaining the death of her husband. The tragic story of Peter Hellstrom is just one of many in the annals of Montana history. After reviewing the details of this attack, I have a few questions for you. Given that Hellstrom was from Sweden, he was experienced with bears. Why do you think the young men followed the bear so closely instead of waiting for it to bleed out? Do you think a dog would have alerted the men that the bear was circling around behind them? Would you go into a dense stand of reeds and bushes to find a wounded bear for enough money to buy a ranch? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Ewe Creek in Denali National Park in Alaska. Now, I know that we have discussed many bear attacks in this area recently, but this area is a hot zone of bear and human conflict at times. The geography here is rolling hills of tundra as this area lies on the north slope of the park. At the ground level, visibility can be minimal and animals can appear and disappear at will. In the forest, we would call the higher levels of foliage a canopy, but in the tundra, what we would think of as a canopy may only be 10 feet high. Common plants in this area are Arctic willow and cotton grass, with numerous berry bushes dotting the space in between. Wildflowers bear their beautiful blooms in short summers and prepare for an early winter each year. The animals in the area include caribou, Arctic wolves, Arctic foxes, muskox, and numerous dangerous grizzly bears. On July 12, 1949, a 22-year-old United States Geological Survey employee by the name of Jack Reed was performing duties on a slope of the tundra of Ewe Creek. His responsibilities took him into the bush as part of basic research and data collection for the agency. As he crested a small rise, he walked a few yards before he noticed 3 large dark shapes a short distance away, out of the corner of his eye. As he turned his head, 3 grizzly bears came into focus. He instantly knew he was far too close for comfort, and that this situation could turn very bad, very quickly if the bears did not choose to flee upon sight of a human being. He had seen bears in the wild before and had seen the fluid and stunning speed with which they covered ground. It was rare to see any grizzly spend even a few seconds in human presence. They almost always turned and ran, or at least immediately walked out of the area. Reed knew that the distance between them would be erased in a matter of only a few seconds and prepared to do something drastic if he needed to. As he froze in an attempt to avoid drawing the bear's attention, one of them looked up from nibbling something on the ground. As soon as the large grizzly locked eyes with Reed, he knew how the situation would unfold. With its head held high, the grizzly huffed and alerted the other two bears, which were only a few yards away. Reed could see the bear pull its rear legs beneath it as it prepared to take the first powerful bounds toward him. As the grizzly stretched out its paws in his direction, Reed was filled with terror and awe at the seriousness of his predicament. As I have reported before, time slows down in bear attack victims' minds sometimes. In the split second, before the bear steamed toward him, Reed thought back at exactly what he saw when he crested the knoll. He remembered how the three bears seemed to be two full-grown bears, and one smaller bear that was likely a cub of one of the others. He knew of the protective nature of sow grizzlies, and that this attack might end in a bluff charge, but if it didn't, well, let's not think of that option yet. The grizzly had bounded a few yards toward him by the time Reed considered his options. Bear spray had not been invented yet, and he was not carrying a firearm, so his only options were slim to none. Playing dead was not really a common concept at the time, so Reed turned and sprinted toward a nearby 20-foot-high cliff. The downhill slant in the hill helped him run faster than he knew he was capable of doing. The cliff approached him rapidly, but the bear closed on him even faster. Reed navigated the bushy undergrowth in the same manner the bear did, by running right over anything in his path. Fortunately for him, all the plants in his path were small enough to permit this. As Reed approached the cliff edge, he prepared to blindly leap toward the bottom, having no idea what lay at the bottom. For all he knew, it was only a few feet, and would only grant him a brief chance at evading attack from the grizzly. Reed drove his knee high on his last step to propel him off the cliff as fast and as far as possible. Just then, the grizzly was a mere foot behind him, and it desperately swatted at him as he was mid-jump. The immense paw of the grizzly sliced across Reed's lower back just as he leaped from the cliff edge, opening up several slashing puncture wounds as its claws tore their way through his flesh. Reed was propelled even faster in his fall after the bear swatted him in the back. He tumbled through the air, waving his arms and kicking his feet in desperation to maintain his balance. Staring toward the base of the cliff, he could see the ground approaching very rapidly. He braced himself for what would be an enormous impact. Reed crashed into the sloped ground and rolled to a stop. As he looked up toward the top of the cliff, he could see the bear glaring down at him. To his terror, the bear didn't simply give up and walk away. It turned toward a circuitous route to the bottom to continue its attack on him. As the bear blurred through the brush toward him, Reed decided the only thing he could do was run. He didn't have time to assess if he was injured in his leap from the cliff, but instantly began sprinting for his life. Reed bobbed and weaved through brush and bush alike, with the bear closing in on him. His saving grace was that the bear would regularly have to stop to search for him, before dashing toward him after relocating him. The bushes screened his escape, allowing him to maintain a short cushion of distance between him and the pursuing grizzly. As he ran, Reed slowly lost the grizzly. After an intense and confusing pursuit, the grizzly turned around and returned to the top of the cliff, apparently rejoining the two other bears. Reed eventually made his way back to his vehicle. He assessed the gashes made on his back from the bear's angry swipe at him as he leaped from the top of the cliff. After arriving at his vehicle, Reed made his way to the hospital where his injuries received medical care. Although Reed committed one of the cardinal sins to be avoided during a bear attack by running, the bushes and brush screening him allowed him to avoid being further injured by the grizzly. Conventional wisdom says that his best option was to drop flat on the ground and play dead, but this undoubtedly would have led to him being mauled severely or even killed. The presence of the cub and the close proximity of the bears when Reed crested the hill created a very dangerous situation that doesn't often end well. It is obviously not recommended to run from any bear today, but before safe guidelines for handling bear encounters were established, many people responded with their survival instinct. This may have kept our ancient ancestors alive, but only the fast or lucky ones. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. What do you think Reed could have done to avoid surprising the grizzlies before cresting the hill? Do you think the bear would have mauled or killed him if he hadn't jumped from the cliff? Do you think running into bushes will be the next evolution in avoiding a bear attack? I will be glad to read and reply to your comments, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks.
Today's episode takes us to Trail Creek in the Flathead National Forest, just west of the border of Glacier National Park. In the park, grizzly bears have a wilderness preserve set aside for them to live as they always have, but the area west of Polebridge is even less populated by people, with fewer roads. It is lower in elevation and lush with thick, uninterrupted forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees, mixed in with small stands of aspen trees. Willow bushes crowd the banks of creeks and streams, along with tens of species of berry bushes. The geography around Camp Creek, which is just a few miles north of Polebridge, is rolling hills covered in dense forests. This area has a lot of deer, elk, and moose roaming the forests, and predators like cougars, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, and black bears hunt the shadows. The area grizzly bears have recently begun developing a hostile conflict with people visiting their territory. Along Trail Creek is a place where the stream submerges and travels a short distance underground. Where it reemerges is called the Bubble Ups. Trail Creek disappears into porous soil and travels through underground channels until it is pushed to the surface by an underlying layer of non-porous rock, like granite. When the water emerges, it does so at such a rate that it bubbles like a spring, but is in fact Trail Creek. It is a popular place to visit just to observe the natural phenomenon. Remote cabins dot the vicinity, and one of them is owned by an elderly couple, whom we will call David and Denise. As of the compilation of this video, their actual names have not been released, and their desires for privacy will be respected. Many of the cabins in this area are off-grid, or may not have telephone service. There is a certain population along Trail Creek Road that likes it that way, and has moved here for a more private and unsophisticated life. On October 1st, 2023, David and Denise were walking their dog along the banks of Trail Creek. Near its origin, Trail Creek lies within a shallow but steep drop-off for much of its course. Thick brush grows along the banks and limits sight to just a few feet in most places. This area isn't exactly easy to get to, so visitors can frequently have the view to themselves and enjoy relative privacy. Around 3 p.m., Denise was near the road and presumed to be on her way back to their car, when a bear blurred from the brush from only a few feet away. The bear knocked her down and began to bite her. Given the couple resided in this area, they had come prepared with bear spray. Upon seeing the bear closing in on his wife, David was quick to react. He unholstered the bear spray that he was carrying and doused the bear as it began its attack on Denise. As the thick orange cloud billowed from the canister and enveloped the area surrounding the bear, the effects of the spray began to set in. The bear began to sneeze, cough, and shake its head, trying to get the irritant out of its mucosal membranes. Undoubtedly, its eyes, nasal cavities, and mouth burned sharply. This overwhelmingly offensive sensation makes bears, and just about any other animal, reconsider the behavior that led up to the situation. In fact, it frequently makes them consider their location, and they change that very quickly. The bear backed away immediately, leaving Denise in agony from the wounds the bear inflicted in its very short attack as well as the bear spray. David looked around to make sure the bear stayed gone and quickly helped Denise back to her feet. She was bleeding and struggled to walk. Together they limped their way back to their car while continually checking over their shoulder. After helping Denise get into their car, David sped down the winding and bumpy backwoods road. He knew they needed to alert authorities and request medical help for Denise. Officials had to be alerted about the bear and its aggressive behavior, and Denise's injuries definitely needed medical attention. David drove them back to where they could pick up a cell signal, and once in range, dialed 911 to get the news of their confrontation with the bear out. He called in for medical help at their location, and was told they should wait for a medical helicopter to arrive with paramedics. A medical response helicopter from the Advanced Life Support and Emergency Rescue Team was dispatched to their location and flew her to the Logan Health Medical Center in Kalispell. Her condition hasn't been released yet, and the seriousness of her injuries is still being kept private. Following this attack, the area around Bubble Ups, including North Fork Road, has been closed until further notice. As you can see by the aerial picture, The closure covers somewhere around 100 square miles. The authorities do this to allow the bear to calm down following the run-in and to prevent more people from being injured by the bear. Additional people in the area may cause the bear to leave, and this would prevent bear researchers from trapping it and learning from it. The incident is still under investigation at the time of the recording of this video, and the bear remains at large, having not been found by researchers. On this channel, we have discussed many attacks in which dogs were present, and this episode is no exception. Reports of how dogs may exacerbate encounters with bears have been noted as well. After doing some research on this topic, I have some potentially valuable information for you. The data really culminates in the importance of a dog depending on its breed. Many dogs react to a bear according to their protective nature, making sure their human is aware of the bear, or even to protect them. There are several breeds that are specifically bred to handle confrontations with bears. The breed that kept coming up in my research is a dog called the Anatolian Shepherd. This breed is a large-framed dog and rugged in its build and demeanor. Lauren Stoddard is a rancher in northwest Montana, near ground zero of grizzly bear activity and confrontations with people. She states that when properly trained, the dogs will actually train grizzlies that wander onto her ranch to look elsewhere for food. She reported that her 8-month-old Anatolian Shepherd once single-handedly turned a grizzly away from her goat herd. In incidents involving black bears between the years of 2010 through 2015, about 46% of dogs involved in altercations were injured. Their owners fared much worse, with 62% of people involved in such attacks being injured. Most of the dogs were off-leash when the confrontation happened, so researchers advise that people keep their dogs on non-retractable leashes as much as possible while in bear country. The report with more valuable details has been linked below for your review, so please check it out. When you adventure out this fall, remember to follow these guidelines. Most bear attacks occur when people approach their food or their cubs or get too close. Authorities recommend speaking gently to the bear while avoiding direct or prolonged eye contact. Slowly wave your arms and avoid high-pitched screams or rapid movements. Hiking in groups is much safer than being alone, and looking big or standing in a higher position may help reduce the possibility of a bear attack. Don't turn your back on a bear and retreat slowly in a sideways manner while keeping an eye on the bear. They also note that climbing a tree may not keep you safe, as both grizzlies and black bears can also do so. If you are a hunter, their advice is as follows. Carry bear spray and be effective in using it. Watch for bear sign like scat or torn up deadfall trees or ant hills. When approaching creeks, be cautious, as bears cannot hear much better than people can, and the noise of the water may screen your approach. Hunt in groups and make noise to alert nearby bears. Be aware that animal calls like elk bugles can attract bears as well as cover scents. Quickly remove your meat and depart the area once you harvest your game animal. If you have to leave a portion of your game animal for later retrieval, make sure that you leave it in a place clearly visible upon your return. Use binoculars or other optical enhancement before you approach to scan for bears guarding the carcass. If the carcass has been disturbed, leave the area immediately and contact authorities for further assistance. After reviewing the details of this attack, I have a few questions for you. Do you think the bear that attacked Denise was a grizzly or a black bear? What contributing factors can you think of that led to the attack? If David hadn't used bear spray, would his wife have been more seriously injured or killed? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.